It was supposed to be a quiet evening, the kind of night where Denzel Washington could step away from the bright lights of Hollywood, away from red carpets, interviews, and the endless cameras, and simply enjoy a little peace. He had been traveling across the country for a private speaking engagement at a local university, sharing his experiences about perseverance, discipline, and the importance of character in an industry that often tried to strip it away. After a long day of flights, greetings, and the kind of handshakes that carried both gratitude and exhaustion, Denzel finally arrived in the small but picturesque town where the university was located. His assistant had booked him into what the website claimed was the most prestigious historic hotel in the state, a grand colonial-style building that had stood for more than a century, boasting gleaming chandeliers, velvet armchairs, and a reputation for old-world charm. But charm, as Denzel would soon discover, could be nothing more than a thin layer of gold paint, hiding the rotting wood of prejudice underneath. When his sleek black car pulled into the cobblestone driveway, the bellhop at the front seemed momentarily frozen, as if the sight of a man like Denzel stepping out of the vehicle disrupted some unspoken expectation of the guests they typically catered to. Denzel, dressed in a simple dark jacket and cap, smiled politely, extending a friendly nod. But the bellhop's eyes flickered briefly with something else: hesitation, confusion, and perhaps even resentment, before he offered a reluctant good evening and took the luggage. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere was different. The chatter of well-dressed guests sipping wine in the lounge seemed to dim as he entered, conversations pausing mid-sentence, eyes turning in his direction in the kind of subtle, almost imperceptible way that most people wouldn't notice, but Denzel did. He'd been in the public eye for decades. He'd traveled to countless cities, and he'd met people from every walk of life. He knew the difference between genuine curiosity and the icy politeness that was laced with judgment. As he approached the front desk, the receptionist, a woman with neatly pinned hair and a smile that looked carved rather than warm, looked him up and down before asking for his name and reservation. He gave it calmly, his voice steady, but she hesitated just a second too long before typing it into the system. Then came the words softly spoken, but carrying the weight of 100 unspoken assumptions. "I'm sorry, sir, but it appears there's been a mistake. We're fully booked tonight." Denzel blinked, his eyes narrowing just slightly. His assistant had confirmed the reservation twice that week, and the suite had been prepaid. "There must be some confusion," he replied, still polite, but with an edge of certainty. "The reservation is under Washington. Denzel Washington." The receptionist's eyes flickered not with recognition of the name, but with something more calculating, like she was deciding how far she could push before this interaction became a problem for her. "I understand, sir, but unfortunately, we don't have any rooms available. Perhaps there's another hotel in town you might find more suitable." That pause, those two words were enough. More suitable. He knew exactly what she meant, even if she wouldn't dare say it outright. The bellhop, still standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, his gaze fixed on the polished marble floor. Around the lobby, the guests who had been pretending not to listen were now watching openly, their eyes scanning Denzel as though trying to measure whether he belonged in their quiet, gilded space. It wasn't anger that rose in him first, it was the familiar, heavy disappointment that had trailed him since his youth. The same one that appeared whenever people decided to judge him not by his achievements, his work, or his humanity, but by the color of his skin. Denzel took a slow breath, his voice still measured as he said, "I see." He didn't raise it. He didn't cause a scene. Simply picked up his bag, nodded once, and walked out into the night air. But as he stood by the curb, looking up at the glowing windows of the hotel, something inside him shifted, not with defeat, but with resolve. Some battles weren't won by arguing at the counter. Some battles were won by changing the game entirely. Denzel walked away from the hotel's glowing facade, the kind of glow that pretended to promise warmth, but in his case, had concealed a wall of cold rejection. The night was crisp, the kind of chill that made every breath visible in the dim halo of the streetlights. And as he moved down the brick-paved sidewalk, he wasn't thinking about finding another place to stay, That would have been the easy solution. The one they expected him to accept the slight, swallow the insult, and disappear quietly into the shadows of inconvenience. But Denzel Washington had not built his life on the easy solution. Every step he took was measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of a decision forming in his mind. One that wasn't fueled by petty revenge but by something far more enduring. The unshakable belief that dignity was not a privilege to be granted, but a birthright to be claimed. His phone buzzed in his pocket, his assistant, already panicked after hearing about the so-called overbooking. She offered to find another 5-star hotel within an hour's drive, but Denzel simply said, "No need," and ended the call. He stopped at the corner, looking back at the building that had just dismissed him. The golden lettering above its grand entrance gleamed under the light, as if mocking him. That's when the thought crystallized, not a fleeting fantasy, but a concrete vision that rooted itself deep in his mind. He wouldn't just stay at that hotel, he would own it. And ownership, he knew, wasn't about having a place to sleep. It was about rewriting the rules that others had used to exclude him. Over the next week, his team worked quietly, discreetly contacting brokers, reviewing property records, and tracing the tangled web of shareholders that kept the hotel in the hands of people who thought they could decide who was suitable for their rooms. Denzel kept his public schedule as normal, smiling at events, delivering speeches, and shaking hands, while behind the scenes, a storm was building. It wasn't just about acquiring a property. It was about transforming a symbol of exclusion into one of welcome. The negotiations began in whispers, its representatives posing as a private investment group interested in hospitality properties. The hotel's owners, unaware of the identity behind the offer, were enticed by the generous figures on the table, especially given their mounting debts from a recent downturn in tourism. Within weeks, what began as a humiliating encounter at a front desk had evolved into a deal worth millions. The papers were signed in a quiet law office, the ink drying on a transaction that would shift the balance of power without a single raised voice or public confrontation. And when the final document slid across the polished oak table to him, Denzel picked up the pen and signed with the same steady hand he had extended to the receptionist that night, the one she had chosen to greet with suspicion rather than respect. He could have called the press, could have turned the purchase into a headline-grabbing spectacle, but that wasn't his way. He believed the most powerful statements were the ones made without a single word, the kind that resonated in silence, until they became impossible to ignore. Still, there was one thing he planned to do: walk back into that lobby. Not as a guest, but as the man who now held the keys to every room in the building. Not to gloat, but to make a point that would ripple far beyond those marble floors. Wasn't just for him, it was for every person who had been told in ways big or small that they didn't belong somewhere. And when he returned, it wouldn't be to check in, it would be to change everything. The morning of his return was quiet. The sky painted in pale streaks of dawn that promised a day of clarity. And as Denzel's car approached the same cobblestone driveway, there was no hesitation in his posture, no trace of the man who had been dismissed and turned away weeks earlier. This time the car was not a hired sedan, but his own understated luxury vehicle, sleek and polished, pulling up to the front entrance as if it had always belonged there. The same bellhop was on duty, though his uniform looked a little more worn, his expression betraying the faint recognition of a moment he perhaps wished he could take back. Denzel stepped out, his movements unhurried, his gaze sweeping across the facade of the hotel, not with bitterness, but with the quiet authority of someone who now knew every inch of its interior, every name on its payroll, every dollar in its accounts. The glass doors swung open before him, and the lobby was exactly as he remembered: polished marble, the glint of chandeliers, the murmurs of well-dressed guests, but this time, the air felt different. He walked straight to the front desk, where the same receptionist stood, her posture rigid, her smile taut. And though her eyes widened slightly when she saw him, she quickly masked it behind the practiced neutrality of hospitality. "Good morning, sir. Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her voice just a little tighter than before. Denzel placed both hands gently on the counter, leaning forward just enough to close the space between them without breaking his calm. "No," he said softly. "I have ownership." For a second, She didn't understand, her brows furrowing as if he had spoken in a language she didn't quite grasp. But then his words began to settle in, piece by piece. Behind her, the manager emerged from his office, his expression a mixture of curiosity and unease, and it was to him that Denzel now turned. "I believe we have some changes to discuss," he said, his tone not sharp but resonant, carrying across the room without raising in volume. The guests nearby had begun to take notice, their conversations faltering as they sensed something unfolding. Denzel explained, in brief and professional terms, that the hotel had been acquired by a new owner himself, fanned that the policies, staff training, and guest treatment would be undergoing a full overhaul. There would be mandatory inclusion, training, community outreach programs, and an open-door policy for anyone willing to treat every guest with dignity, regardless of background, appearance, or bank account. As he spoke, his voice was steady, unshaken by the eyes fixed on him. The staff could not escape the truth that this was not a man seeking revenge, but justice. The receptionist's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the papers on the desk, perhaps realizing that the mistake she had made that night had set in motion a change she could never have imagined. Denzel concluded by saying, "This place will stand for more than just luxury. It will stand for welcome. And if anyone here has a problem with that, this is the time to walk away." The silence that followed was thick, but it wasn't hostile. It was transformative, like the moment before a storm breaks and clears the air. Slowly, Denzel stepped back from the counter, giving them space to absorb the reality. He didn't need applause or validation. He had come here not to be served, but to serve notice that the rules had changed. And as he turned toward the lounge, where sunlight now streamed in through tall windows, the first thing he saw was a young black couple checking in, their eyes lighting up as they caught sight of him, perhaps without yet knowing why he was there, but he knew. And that was enough.